December 30th, 2025. The bombs fell on ships owned by the United Arab Emirates. Within hours, the geopolitical earthquake that experts had been predicting for years was no longer theory. Two nations that had stood shoulder to shoulder for decades, that had waged wars together, that had shaped the modern Middle East as partners, were now bombing each other. And at the center of this divorce that nobody saw coming lies a single explosive question. What do you do when your ally becomes too close to your enemy? This isn't just another Middle Eastern conflict. This is the unraveling of one of the most powerful partnerships the Arab world has ever seen, and it's happening because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have chosen completely opposite paths on the most controversial issue in the region. Israel, one embraced it, one rejected it. And now the entire architecture of Middle Eastern power is collapsing, reforming, and splitting into two rival camps that could define global geopolitics for the next generation. Welcome to the story of how the Indo-Abrahamic Bloc is tearing apart the Gulf, why Saudi Arabia is building what some are calling an Islamic NATO, and how a partnership between India, Israel, and the Emirates is reshaping everything we thought we knew about the Middle East.
Before we go further, I need to be clear about something. What you're seeing here is only the public layer of this story. For channel members, I break down what happens next, the timelines decision makers are actually working with, and the scenarios that won't be discussed openly. If you want access to that deeper analysis, you can join the channel by clicking the join button below.
Let's rewind to understand how we got here. For most of modern history, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were basically inseparable. Think of them as the power couple of the Gulf. When Yemen's civil war erupted in 2015, they formed a military coalition together. When they decided Qatar was getting too cozy with Iran and Turkey, they blockaded it together from 2017 to 2021. When oil prices needed managing, they coordinated through OPEC. They were the twin pillars of Gulf stability, the heavyweights of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the undisputed leaders of the Sunni Arab world. Their crown princes, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE, were even nicknamed the two MBSs. The bromance, as analysts called it, seemed unbreakable, until it wasn't. The cracks started appearing in 2018, and the issue was Yemen. Both countries had entered that war with the same stated goal: push back the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels and restore the internationally recognized government. But somewhere along the way, their strategies diverged dramatically. Saudi Arabia kept its focus on fighting the Houthis and maintaining Yemen as one unified country. The Saudis saw Yemen's unity as essential for their own national security. After all, Yemen shares an 800-mile border with Saudi Arabia. A fractured Yemen meant instability right on their doorstep. But the UAE had different ideas. Abu Dhabi started backing a separatist group called the Southern Transitional Council, the STC. This group wanted South Yemen to break away and become independent again, just like it was before 1990. The Emiratis poured weapons, training, and money into the STC, helping them carve out their own mini-state in southern Yemen. For a while, this was just an annoying disagreement between allies. But in December 2025, it exploded. The UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council launched a massive offensive, sweeping across southern and eastern Yemen. They captured huge swaths of territory in Hadramaut and Al-Mahra, the oil-rich regions that border Saudi Arabia. These weren't just random provinces. Control of these areas meant control of critical ports, oil infrastructure, and, most importantly, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's most strategic shipping choke points. For Riyadh, this was a red line. Saudi Arabia watched as UAE-backed forces advanced toward their border, and they saw something terrifying: encirclement, because this wasn't just about Yemen anymore. Here's where Israel enters the picture, and here's where everything gets complicated. In 2020, the UAE shocked the world by signing the Abraham Accords, becoming one of the first Arab countries to normalize relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia didn't join. And that decision, that single choice, has become the defining split of the entire region. The UAE didn't just normalize with Israel, they went all in. Emirati and Israeli officials started coordinating on everything: intelligence sharing, military technology, economic partnerships, even tourism. The relationship became so close that diplomatic sources now say Saudi Arabia believes the UAE and Israel are pursuing a joint strategy, not just cooperation, a joint strategy. And what is that strategy? According to multiple diplomatic sources, speaking to outlets like the Christian Science Monitor and the European Council on Foreign Relations, Saudi officials have concluded that the UAE and Israel are working together to fragment the Arab world. Let's break down what that means. Look at Yemen. The STC that the UAE backs has openly offered Israel normalization and security cooperation in exchange for Israeli support for South Yemen's independence. Israel already had an intelligence presence on the Yemeni island of Socotra, which until December was under UAE control. Look at Sudan. The UAE supports the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group that's been fighting Sudan's regular army. Saudi Arabia backs the central government and the Sudanese armed forces. The RSF's campaign has been brutal, culminating in a horrific massacre at El Fasher last October. The Saudis see this as the UAE destabilizing a neighboring country to gain influence. Look at Somaliland. This is the big one. On December 26, 2025, Israel became the first country in the world to officially recognize Somaliland as an independent state. Somaliland is a breakaway region that declared independence from Somalia in 1991 but has never been recognized by any UN member state. Until Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu signed the declaration, calling it an expansion of the Abraham Accords. The UAE has had a long-standing presence in Somaliland, building a major military base at Berbera Port and pumping investment into the region. They didn't officially support the recognition, but here's the key detail. When Saudi Arabia joined scores of Arab and Muslim countries in condemning Israel's recognition of Somaliland, the UAE's name was notably absent from that list. Saudi Arabia noticed. They noticed that the UAE was silent when it should have been standing with the Arab consensus. They noticed that Israel was recognizing a separatist region where the UAE has massive investments in military infrastructure. And they drew a conclusion: this is coordinated. This is a pattern. Yemen, Sudan, Somaliland, and potentially Syria, where reports suggest the UAE and Israel are cooperating to support Druze separatist groups. Riyadh sees a strategy of fragmentation, of breaking apart existing states to create smaller, more manageable pieces that can be influenced and controlled. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, something remarkable was taking shape. They all worry about Islamist movements. They all see Iran and Turkey's regional ambitions as threats. They all have reasons to work together. And in 2022, this concept became reality with the formation of the I2U2 group. That's India, Israel, UAE, and the United States. The first summit happened in July 2022 with the leaders of all four countries participating. On paper, I2U2 focuses on economic cooperation, renewable energy projects in India, food security initiatives, technology partnerships, space ventures. But scratch the surface and the strategic dimension is obvious. India brings a vibrant economy, a massive market, and growing technological capability. Israel brings cutting-edge military technology and intelligence expertise. The UAE brings financial capital and strategic ports. The United States brings political commitment and security guarantees. Together, they're building what some analysts call a new trans-regional order. And here's what makes this so powerful. It's not just talk. On January 19th, 2026, just weeks ago, UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed visited India. They signed agreements that included a letter of intent on a strategic defense partnership framework, a $3 billion liquefied natural gas deal, and a commitment to double bilateral trade to $200 billion by 2032. $200 billion. That's not a photo op. That's a full economic and strategic realignment. India and the UAE are locking in a partnership that spans energy, defense, technology, and trade. They're coordinating on regional security. And most importantly, they're united by a shared vision. Use force and technology to reshape the region's power structure. This is where Saudi Arabia drew the line, because Riyadh watched this Indo-Abrahamic alignment taking shape, and they saw their worst nightmare, being encircled. Think about it from Saudi Arabia's perspective. To their east, the UAE and its ally India. To their west, Israel expanding its influence. To their north, potentially Syria, where Israel and the UAE might be supporting separatists. To their south, Yemen, where the SDC, backed by the UAE, is making moves. Everywhere the Saudis look, they see this alignment working against them. And they decided they needed their own coalition, their own alliance, their own answer. Enter the Islamic coalition. On September 17th, 2025, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement in Riyadh. This wasn't a vague cooperation pact. This was a mutual defense treaty. The language is stark. Any aggression against one country will be treated as aggression against both. It's modeled on NATO's Article 5, the collective defense clause that says an attack on one member is an attack on all. Pakistan brings nuclear weapons to this partnership. Let that sink in. Saudi Arabia just formalized a defense treaty with a nuclear-armed state. Pakistani Defense Minister Khawaja Asif even hinted that Pakistan's nuclear capabilities would be available under the pact, though he later walked that back after international uproar. But the message was sent. Saudi Arabia now has a formal military alliance with a country that has atomic bombs. But it didn't stop there. In January 2026, Turkey entered talks to join the Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact. Turkey, a NATO member, a country with one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East, a country that has been at odds with Saudi Arabia for years over everything from the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi to their support for opposite sides in Libya and Syria. Yet suddenly, they're talking about joining a mutual defense alliance together. Some Turkish officials have called it preliminary discussions. Others say a draft agreement is already prepared after 10 months of negotiations. But whether it's finalized or not, the very fact that Turkey is in talks signals a massive realignment. The three countries, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey, bring complementary strengths: Saudi money, Pakistani nuclear capability and military manpower, Turkish conventional military power and defense industry. Together, they're being called an Islamic NATO by some observers, though that term is misleading, because most Muslim countries aren't part of it and religion isn't really the driving factor. But the comparison to NATO is apt in one sense. This is about collective security. This is about creating a military bloc that can stand against the other bloc. And here's what makes this so significant. For decades, for generations, the core tension in the Middle East was between Sunni Arab states led by Saudi Arabia and Shiite Iran backed by its proxies. That was the organizing principle of regional politics: Saudi Arabia and Iran, Arab and Persian, Sunni and Shia. But that framework is dead. Iran has been severely weakened by Israel's campaign against Hezbollah and Hamas. The so-called axis of resistance that Iran built across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza is in tatters. Hezbollah's leadership has been decimated. Hamas is shattered. Iranian proxies across the region are in retreat. For the first time in 4 decades, Iran's regional influence is at its lowest point. And into that vacuum, 2 new blocs are emerging. The Abrahamic coalition centered on the UAE, Israel, and India with American support, and the Islamic coalition led by Saudi Arabia with Pakistan and potentially Turkey. These aren't just different alliances. They represent fundamentally different visions for what the Middle East should be. The Abrahamic coalition believes in using military force and technological superiority to maintain stability. They think being strong, being Sparta, as Netanyahu described Israel, is the path to peace. They're building a mutual defense framework based on collective security. They prioritize religious and cultural identity, even if it's more rhetorical than real. And the flashpoint, the issue that separates these 2 camps more than anything else, is Israel and Palestine. The UAE normalized with Israel through the Abraham Accords and essentially sidelined the Palestinian issue. The Accords were revolutionary because they broke the long-standing Arab consensus that normalization with Israel required progress on Palestinian statehood. The UAE said, "We can have relations with Israel without solving the Palestinian problem." Saudi Arabia has refused to follow that path. Riyadh has made it crystal clear, repeatedly, that they will not normalize relations with Israel unless there is concrete progress toward a Palestinian state. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has stuck to this position, even under intense pressure from both the Biden and Trump administrations. No Palestinian state, no normalization. This isn't just about principle, it's about legitimacy. Saudi Arabia positions itself as the guardian of Islam's 2 holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. Abandoning the Palestinians, especially after the Gaza war that killed tens of thousands, would undermine that role. It would hand Turkey and Qatar, competitors for Islamic leadership, a massive propaganda victory. But there's more to it than that. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself admitted that Israel is closely watching Saudi Arabia's recent shift toward Turkey and Qatar. He said publicly that Israel expects anyone who wants normalization to not participate in efforts by forces that want the opposite of peace. Translation: Saudi Arabia's new partnerships with Turkey and Qatar are seen by Israel as hostile moves, because Turkey and Qatar are the mediators of the Gaza ceasefire. They have close relationships with Hamas. They've been some of the harshest critics of Israel's war in Gaza. And now Saudi Arabia is building defense ties with them while the UAE stays close to Israel. The battle lines are clear. What happened in Yemen at the end of 2025 was the moment these tensions exploded into the open. When the UAE-backed STC launched their offensive in December, seizing territory near the Saudi border, Riyadh's response was swift and brutal. On December 29th, Saudi Arabia publicly criticized the UAE's role in Yemen for the first time in over a decade. On December 30th, Saudi warplanes bombed UAE-linked weapons shipments in 2 Emirati vessels in Yemeni ports. By January 7, 2026, the Saudi-backed Presidential Leadership Council had driven the STC back from their gains. And on January 9th, the STC's leader Idris al-Zubaydi fled to the UAE, and the organization was dissolved. The Emiratis had been beaten, and they withdrew completely from Yemen. But it wasn't just a military defeat. It was a propaganda war. Saudi and Emirati media figures, influencers, think tanks, all launched ferocious campaigns against each other. Emiratis called the Saudis bullies who support the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist movement that Abu Dhabi despises. Saudis called the UAE anti-Islamic, pro-Israel, and reckless for backing secessionists across the region. The language of mutual recrimination and accusation between these longtime allies recalled the worst of what they used to say about Qatar during the 2017 to 2021 blockade. But this time, the stakes are higher, because Qatar is a small country. The UAE is the second largest economy in the Arab world after Saudi Arabia. This is a clash of heavyweights, and the fallout is already being felt across multiple arenas. In Sudan, the proxy war between the Saudi-backed Sudanese armed forces and the UAE-backed rapid support forces continues to devastate the country. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reportedly urged the Trump administration in November 2025 to increase pressure on the UAE over its role in Sudan. In Somalia, the split over Somaliland recognition has created a new fault line. In Syria, competing visions for the post-Assad future are colliding, with Saudi Arabia backing the new government, while reports suggest the UAE and Israel are supporting Druze separatists. In Libya, old divisions are being reactivated, with the UAE backing General Khalifa Haftar. Every regional conflict is becoming a proxy battlefield between these two camps. And for other countries in the region, this is a nightmare. Egypt, for example, has deep ties with both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Egyptian officials have publicly affirmed their total support for Riyadh's position on Yemen. But Egypt also depends heavily on Emirati investment and financial support. They're being forced to choose, or at least to walk a very delicate tightrope. The same goes for Bahrain, Jordan, and other Arab states that have historically maintained good relations with both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. The old Gulf unity is gone. The idea of a unified GCC stance on regional issues is dead. In September 2025, after years of no contact following various disputes, UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed visited Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to explore creating a unitary Arab Gulf front. That was after the Israeli strike on Qatar in September 2025 that shocked the region and reminded everyone of their shared vulnerabilities. There was brief momentum for the Gulf states to develop a unified vision. That momentum is now completely destroyed. The personal relationship between the two crown princes, once described as a bromance, has collapsed. The Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed partnership that shaped regional politics from 2017 to 2021 is over. And that matters because in the Gulf, personal relationships between rulers often matter more than institutional frameworks. When the two MBSs were aligned, they could coordinate everything from oil policy to military intervention to economic strategy. Now they are on opposite sides. For Israel, this split creates both opportunities and serious concerns. On one hand, the UAE remains a close and committed partner. The relationship has only deepened since October 7, 2023. While many countries grew critical of Israel after the Gaza war, the Emirates stayed supportive. They continued intelligence cooperation, continued economic partnerships, continued diplomatic coordination. For Israel, having a wealthy, technologically advanced Arab state as an ally is invaluable. And through the UAE, Israel has been able to expand its reach across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East in ways that would have been impossible without the Abraham Accords. But on the other hand, Saudi normalization, which once seemed inevitable, now looks increasingly unlikely. Israeli officials are privately expressing doubt that it will happen anytime soon. Bloomberg reported in early February 2026 that Israel is dismayed by what it sees as hostile moves by Saudi Arabia. The formation of the defense pact with Pakistan, the talks with Turkey, the public criticism of Israel, the shift in Saudi media toward more anti-Israel rhetoric. All of this signals that Mohammed bin Salman is moving in the opposite direction from Mohammed bin Zayed. And for Israel, losing the possibility of Saudi normalization is a huge strategic setback. Saudi Arabia is the largest Arab economy, the birthplace of Islam, the leader of the Sunni world. Normalization with Riyadh would have been transformative, opening the door for other Arab states to follow. Now that door appears to be closing, possibly for years or even permanently. Some Israeli officials worry this isn't temporary. They're trying to figure out whether the shifts in Saudi policy are tactical, maybe driven by short-term concerns about the Palestinians or regional instability, or whether this is a fundamental, permanent redrawing of the regional balance of power. A confidant of Netanyahu and an Israeli diplomat, both speaking anonymously, told Bloomberg the concern is real. Because if Saudi Arabia is building a rival bloc, if they're creating what amounts to an anti-Israel coalition with Pakistan and Turkey, then the strategic environment has changed completely. For the United States, the split between two of its most important partners is a massive headache. Washington has close relationships with both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. American weapons flow to both countries. American companies do business in both places. American strategic interests depend on stability in the Gulf, which is now anything but stable. The Biden administration tried for years to broker a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, seeing it as a way to reshape the entire region. That effort failed. Now the Trump administration is taking a different approach. They're apparently accepting that Saudi normalization isn't happening, at least not in the near term. Instead, they're giving Saudi Arabia weapons, technology, and military support without demanding normalization as the price. This is a shift. Now it's, we'll support you anyway. That change tells Saudi Arabia and other Arab states that they don't have to recognize Israel to maintain good relations with Washington. which makes the Abraham Accords less compelling as a model. For India, this is an opportunity. New Delhi is playing both sides brilliantly. On one hand, India is deeply embedded in the Indo-Abrahamic framework. The defense partnership with the UAE is intensifying. Trade is exploding. Energy security is being locked in through massive LNG deals. Cooperation with Israel on technology and defense is stronger than ever. India is positioning itself as the rising power in this triangle, the bridge between the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. But, on the other hand, India is carefully maintaining its relationship with Saudi Arabia. Just days after the Emirati president's visit to India in January 2026, India held a strategic dialogue with Saudi Arabia on January 28th. Prime Minister Modi is preparing a visit to Israel while also rescheduling a visit from Netanyahu, and India hosted the second India-Arab conference on January 31st, with representatives from all 22 Arab League countries attending. India is demonstrating strategic autonomy. They're not choosing sides, they're engaging with everyone. For a country that has historically been non-aligned, this is classic Indian foreign policy. Maintain relationships across divides, don't get locked into exclusive blocs, maximize flexibility. For Pakistan, the partnership with Saudi Arabia is transformative. Pakistan has long had close ties with the kingdom, but formalizing them into a mutual defense treaty changes everything. Pakistan gains financial support from Saudi Arabia at a time when its economy is struggling. It gains diplomatic weight in the Middle East. And crucially, it potentially gets cover for its rivalry with India. If India deepens its security partnership with the UAE, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are now rivals, then Pakistan's alliance with Saudi Arabia becomes a counterweight. Some analysts like Ian Bremmer have suggested the pact could alter India's security calculus, particularly if Saudi Arabia is committed to coming to Pakistan's defense in the event of a conflict. That's a huge shift in the regional balance. For Turkey, joining this Saudi-Pakistani framework would be remarkable. Turkey is a NATO member. It has formal security guarantees from the United States and other Western allies. So why would Ankara need a defense pact with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan? Several reasons. First, it's a hedge. Turkey doesn't fully trust Washington anymore, especially after years of tensions over Syria, over the F-35 fighter jet program, over sanctions. Having alternative security partnerships reduces dependence on the West. Second, it's about regional influence. Turkey sees itself as a leader of the Muslim world, a role that President Erdogan has cultivated. Being part of a Saudi-Pakistan-Turkey axis reinforces that image. Third, it's economic. Saudi finance would help Turkey's inflation-battered economy. Fourth, it's strategic positioning. If Turkey believes the region is splitting into camps, better to be in the camp that includes Saudi Arabia's money and Pakistan's military power than to be isolated. But there are complications. Turkey's potential nuclear deterrence from Pakistan is basically meaningless. Pakistani missiles don't have the range to cover Turkey's potential adversaries like Russia or Greece. Pakistan isn't going to station nuclear weapons abroad, and Turkey already has American nuclear weapons stationed at Incirlik Air Base as part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement. So the nuclear angle is more symbolic than substantive. What Turkey would really gain is access to a regional security architecture independent of the West, trade opportunities, defense industry cooperation, and political alignment with two countries that are increasingly important in a multipolar world. As of early February 2026, the status of Turkey's accession to the Saudi-Pakistan Pact remains unclear. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has confirmed talks are ongoing, but said no deal has been signed. Some Saudi sources told AFP that Turkey won't join, that it will remain strictly bilateral between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Other reports say a draft trilateral agreement is already prepared. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Serious discussions are happening, but the final shape of any agreement is still being negotiated. What's certain is this: the Middle East is entering a new era defined by competition between two blocs. The Abrahamic coalition, centered on the UAE, Israel, and India with American support, and the Islamic coalition, led by Saudi Arabia with Pakistan and potentially Turkey. These aren't formal alliances with charters and headquarters. They're looser frameworks, overlapping partnerships, shared interests. But they're real. And the competition between them is reshaping everything from trade routes to military deployments to diplomatic alignments. The fault lines are becoming clear. The Abrahamic camp prioritizes technology, economic integration, and force. They're building the India-Middle East-Europe economic corridor to link their economies physically. They're coordinating on security threats. They're willing to challenge existing borders and support non-state actors if it serves their interests. They see Israel as an indispensable partner, a source of military technology and intelligence capability that no one else can provide. They believe strength deters conflict. The Islamic camp prioritizes sovereignty, legitimacy, and political coalitions. They're defending existing borders against what they see as fragmentation strategies. They're building mutual defense frameworks based on collective security. They're anchoring their identity in Islamic solidarity, Even if it's more rhetorical than theological, they see Israel as a destabilizing force, an expansionist power whose regional ambitions need to be balanced against. They believe legitimacy creates stability. Neither camp is monolithic. The Abrahamic coalition has tensions. India is wary of appearing too anti-Muslim, which is why it carefully maintains ties with Saudi Arabia and hosts Arab League conferences. The UAE and Israel don't agree on everything, particularly regarding the Palestinians. The Islamic coalition has its own problems. Saudi Arabia and Turkey have a long history of rivalry. Pakistan's economy is fragile. The whole framework could collapse if personal relationships between leaders sour or if economic pressures become too severe. But despite these internal contradictions, the split is real and it's deepening. Every new development seems to reinforce it rather than bridge it. When the Yemen confrontation happened in December, it could have been a wake-up call that led to reconciliation. Instead, it became the moment the divorce went public. When Israel recognized Somaliland, it could have been ignored as a one-off provocation. Instead, it became another data point in the pattern that Saudi Arabia sees. When Saudi Arabia signed the defense pact with Pakistan, it could have been dismissed as symbolic. Instead, it became the foundation for potentially bringing Turkey into a rival security architecture. The implications are enormous. For global trade, the split threatens corridors like the India-Middle East-Europe corridor that require cooperation between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The land route was supposed to link all the Gulf states with Jordan, Israel, and Europe. Now the European Union is looking at alternative routes through Oman to de-risk their connectivity projects. For oil markets, the split could undermine OPEC Plus coordination. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE can't agree on regional security, can they agree on production quotas and price management? For counterterrorism, the split creates opportunities for extremist groups to exploit divisions. For Palestinian statehood, the split is both good news and bad news. Good news because Saudi Arabia is holding firm on the requirement for Palestinian rights before normalization. Bad news because the UAE has shown that Arab states can have full relations with Israel without addressing Palestinian concerns, which weakens the Palestinians' negotiating position. For the possibility of war, the split is genuinely dangerous. If the UAE and Saudi Arabia are backing opposite sides in Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Syria, and potentially Libya, those conflicts could escalate. A miscalculation in any of these theaters could spiral into a broader confrontation. The December fighting in Yemen showed how quickly things can go kinetic. Saudi warplanes bombed UAE vessels. That's not a diplomatic spat. That's a military engagement between two countries that are supposed to be allies. The next phase of this competition will be critical. Will the Islamic coalition actually materialize with Turkey as a formal member? Will Egypt be forced to choose between Saudi money and Emirati investment? Will the I2-U2 framework expand to include Egypt and Saudi Arabia as originally envisioned, or will it remain limited to India, Israel, UAE, and the US? Will other Arab states join one camp or the other, or will they try to stay neutral? Will Iran, currently weakened, attempt to exploit this split to rebuild its influence? Will the United States maintain relationships with both camps, or will it be forced to choose? These are the questions that will define the next decade of Middle Eastern politics. And they all stem from one fundamental split. The UAE chose Israel, Saudi Arabia rejected Israel, and everything else followed from that. The Abraham Accords, which seemed like the beginning of a new regional order in 2020, have instead become the catalyst for a regional civil war. Not a shooting war, at least not yet, but a cold war between competing visions, competing alliances, competing interests. The term Indo-Abrahamic might sound academic or abstract, but it represents something very real. The convergence of India, Israel, and the UAE based on shared anxieties about Iran, Turkey, Islamist movements, and regional instability. It's a partnership built on the belief that military strength and technological superiority can reshape the Middle East. And it's directly opposed by a Saudi-led framework built on the belief that sovereignty, legitimacy, and collective security should take precedence. The UAE is supporting paramilitary and secessionist groups across the region. Saudi Arabia is building political coalitions to preserve established borders. The UAE wants to fragment, Saudi Arabia wants to unify. The UAE embraces Israel as a strategic partner. Saudi Arabia sees Israel as a threat to be balanced against. These aren't just policy differences. These are fundamentally incompatible worldviews. And so we arrive at the present moment, February 2026, with the Middle East more fractured than at any point since the Arab Spring. 2 new blocs are forming. Old alliances are dead. The question now isn't whether this competition will define the region's future. It's whether this competition can be managed without exploding into open conflict. Because when you have 2 powerful camps, both armed, both backed by major global powers, both convinced they're right and both competing for influence across multiple unstable countries, the risk of escalation is severe. The Indo-Abrahamic Bloc and the Islamic coalition aren't just names, they're the new reality. And the Saudi-UAE split over Israel isn't just a diplomatic dispute. It's the defining geopolitical rupture of the modern Middle East. How this plays out will determine not just the future of the Gulf, but the balance of power across Africa, Asia, and Europe. The stakes couldn't be higher, the sides are chosen, and the competition has only just begun.